In the stifling heat of a karaoke night, the city's morgue was shrouded in an unsettling silence. The distinct smell of formaldehyde and the faint hum of fluorescent lights were almost the only things filling the space, except for the occasional footsteps of the staff. Julia, a woman with a determined gaze and constantly busy hands, was alone on her shift. The routine at the morgue was meticulous and solemn, but tonight, something seemed to have changed. As Julia organized the paperwork and prepared the bodies for autopsy, a low, indistinct whisper filled the air. She stopped and looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. There was no one else in the morgue. The whisper continued, like a distant melody, but with a tone heavy with despair and agony. Julia tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just fatigue playing tricks on her mind. As minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer and more definable. Words began to form sentences, but the murmurs were so fragmented that she could barely make out what was being said. "Help us. Don't leave. We're here." Each sentence seemed to come from a different place, as if the dead were trying to communicate from beyond the grave. The sudden cold that settled in the morgue made Julia shiver. She turned to check if there was something wrong with the ventilation system, but found nothing. She tried to rationalize what she was hearing, but the whispers grew more urgent and insistent. The sound seemed to echo throughout the building, passing through walls and seeping into every corner of the morgue. Julia took a sip of cold coffee, trying to stay calm. She decided it was time to call someone to investigate, but when she picked up the phone, the line was dead. The whisper had turned into a low, desperate cry, as if a crowd of voices were pleading for something no one could understand. Fear began to set in for Julia, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As the whisper continued, Julia couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was about to happen, something that would change her life forever. The morgue, once a familiar and manageable workplace, now seemed to be transforming into a scene of absolute terror. She knew that tonight would be unlike any other. What was coming was something she couldn't fully predict or understand. And so, in the middle of the night, with the murmur of the dead growing louder and louder, Julia began to wonder if the city's true calm was about to be shattered by something that transcended life and death. As the days went by, Julia tried to continue her life as normally as possible. The unbearable heat of Rio de Janeiro seemed to intensify, as if the city were breathing with an increasingly stifling warmth. But what bothered her more than the weather was the constant feeling of being watched. The city, with its vibrant and bustling streets, was starting to feel like a place of unease for Julia. She walked through the streets of Rio, trying to ignore the disturbing echo that seemed to follow her steps. The noise of traffic, the infectious rhythm of samba from the bars, and the sound of conversations at street corners couldn't drown out the whispers that now seemed to persist in her mind, blending with the urban chaos. Julia began to realize that these murmurs were not just a fantasy caused by stress, but something real and tangible. One day, while shopping at a popular market in São Cristóvão, Julia heard the whisper again. Amid the voices of vendors and the shouts of passers-by, a voice, almost imperceptible, seemed to call her name. She turned abruptly, searching for the source of the sound, but found only curious and unconcerned glances. The feeling of disorientation intensified with each step. At night, as she walked through the illuminated streets of Lapa, the whispers became almost audible amidst the noise of bars and cars. She tried to convince herself it was just fatigue, but the murmurs grew more specific and directed. "Julia, listen to us, you're not alone, they're coming." Fear began to mix with a sense of desperation. Julia's unease was worsened one rainy night when she heard the whispers again while waiting at a bus stop. The sound seemed to come from a group of people around her, but when she looked, she saw everyone absorbed in their own conversations and concerns. The voices of the dead were now infiltrating everyday life, as if trying to communicate with her through the city itself. On her way home, Julia started to notice a constant presence, as if an invisible shadow were following her steps. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. Looking back, there was nothing but darkness and rain, but the fear that something sinister might be approaching was unavoidable. Julia knew something was deeply wrong. The city, with its vitality and unceasing movement, now seemed to hide something macabre beneath the surface. And as the murmurs persisted, she began to question whether the secrets of the dead were about to unearth something far more terrifying than she could imagine. Tension grew with every step Julia took through the city. The oppressive heat seemed to mix with an increasingly tangible sense of unease. The voices of the dead had left the morgue and spread throughout the city, now seeming to follow Julia with every movement. The vibrant and lit streets of Rio de Janeiro had turned into a maze of fear and paranoia. On a night when the full moon bathed the city in silvery light, Julia was heading home after an exhausting shift at the morgue. As she crossed a deserted street near Praca 15, she heard the whispers again. This time, however, they were not mere murmurs, they were clear and unsettling words. "You can't escape. We're close. Go to the cemetery." Julia quickened her pace, feeling a growing pressure in her chest. The voices seemed to get closer and closer, as if an invisible crowd was forming behind her. The traffic had diminished, and the feeling of being alone intensified. Fear was beginning to turn into panic as she tried to make sense of what was happening. When Julia turned a corner, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. She looked back, and although she saw no one, she felt the presence of something supernatural. The shadows of the street stretched threateningly, as if moving to corner her. Her footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalks, and the sound of the whispers grew louder, mixed with the pounding of her own racing heart. The next day, as Julia walked through the city center, the same phenomenon occurred. The whispers were now mingled with everyday sounds, becoming a constant part of her life. She noticed that the murmurs seemed to intensify when she passed certain places, an old bookstore, an abandoned building, and even a small chapel on the corner. The city seemed to be filled with spots where the presence of the dead was stronger, and Julia felt guided, or perhaps compelled, to follow these paths. The situation reached a critical point one night when Julia saw spectral figures forming in the shadows around her. They seemed to materialize from the walls and lampposts themselves, with empty eyes and expressions of eternal suffering. The sense of panic was overwhelming, and Julia tried to run, but the spirits seemed to follow her every move, not allowing her to escape. The streets, once familiar and safe, now felt like a maze of horror. The feeling of being chased became almost unbearable. Julia found herself fleeing through deserted streets, desperately trying to find refuge. The voices and ghostly figures were everywhere, surrounding her and closing in. The city, which had once been a place of routine and normalcy, now seemed to be transforming into a living nightmare. As Julia ran, one thought formed in her mind: the spirits were trying to communicate something greater, something she still couldn't understand. And deep in her mind, a terrifying question arose: what was the purpose of these whispers, and why were they so determined to follow her? After weeks of terror and relentless pursuit, Julia was exhausted both physically and emotionally. The whispers of the dead had not only become a constant part of her life, but had also begun to obsessively occupy her thoughts. In a moment of desperation and searching for answers, Julia decided to investigate the source of the murmurs that haunted her. Something inside her insisted that the key to understanding the whole mystery was tied to the São João Batista Cemetery. The cemetery, with its majestic architecture and ancient tombs, seemed shrouded in an aura of mystery and reverence. It was a revered place, but also surrounded by dark stories and urban legends. Julia felt a mix of fear and determination as she walked through the ornate gates of the cemetery, resolved to uncover what was causing her agony. The sun was setting, and a light mist began to form among the gravestones and mausoleums. Julia started exploring the older sections of the cemetery, where the tombs were covered in moss and the inscriptions on the gravestones were worn by time. As she delved deeper, the whispers of the dead became almost tangible, as if every step she took triggered a new wave of desperate murmurs. She stopped in front of a particularly old gravestone, with inscriptions in Latin nearly erased by time. A strange feeling enveloped her, as if the stone were emitting a dark energy. Julia touched the gravestone, feeling a chilling cold seep into her fingers. At that moment, the whisper turned into a nearly deafening scream. "Find the truth, the answer is here." Julia looked around, trying to identify any clue or pattern that could explain the recent events. Her eyes fell on an isolated mausoleum, situated on a distant hill. The mausoleum was imposing and seemed to have an aura of ancient secrets. It was a structure that seemed out of place with the other buildings in the cemetery, with its wrought iron doors and enigmatic inscriptions. Determined to explore the mausoleum, Julia crossed the cemetery, feeling the invisible eyes of the dead following her every step. When she reached the entrance, the door was slightly ajar, as if someone had deliberately left it open. The darkness inside was almost palpable, and a smell of dampness and decay filled the air. Inside the mausoleum, Julia found a spiral staircase leading down into the depths of the earth. With each step she descended, the sound of the whispers seemed to intensify, becoming a cacophony of wails and desperate pleas. At the bottom of the staircase, Julia encountered an underground space filled with sarcophagi and ancient artifacts, covered in dust and cobwebs. The environment was oppressive and charged with unsettling energy. As she examined the sarcophagi, Julia discovered an old book hidden in a secret compartment. The pages were filled with ancient texts and esoteric symbols that seemed to describe rituals and practices associated with communicating with the beyond. As Julia leafed through the book, a disturbing thought emerged. São João Batista Cemetery was not just a place of eternal rest, but also a focal point for something far more sinister. The atmosphere in the mausoleum was charged with a sense of imminent revelation. Julia knew she had found a crucial clue, something that could finally explain the reason behind the whispers of the dead and, more importantly, how she could end the terrifying pursuit that had taken over her life. The mystery of the cemetery was beginning to unravel, and Julia was on the verge of discovering truths that would challenge her understanding of life and death. The discovery in the mausoleum was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but Julia knew she needed more information to understand the connection between the whispers of the dead and the events happening in her life. Remembering old stories and urban legends she had heard during her childhood, Julia found herself thinking about the Maid de Agua, a mythological figure deeply rooted in Carioca culture. According to legend, the Maid de Agua was an entity that dwelled in the waters of the rivers and lagoons of Rio de Janeiro. Often associated with mysteries and tragedies, she was described as a beautiful and seductive figure but with a merciless temperament towards those who came too close to her waters. It was believed that her presence was felt in times of crisis and despair, and many said she had the power to drag people into an eternity of torment. Immersed in her quest for answers, Julia decided to investigate this legend more deeply. She visited Lagoa Rodrigo de Freitas, a place that, while lively and popular during the day, took on an enigmatic aura at night. The twilight cast a dark tone over the waters, and Julia felt a chill as she walked along the shore. As night fell, the lagoon seemed to come alive. The sounds of birds and city noises faded, replaced by a deep and unsettling silence. Julia noticed that the water level was lower than usual, revealing areas of mud and algae that were not usually visible. Something inside her told her that the Maid de Agua was present, or at least that her presence was somehow connected to what was happening. As she watched the waters, Julia began to hear a low sound, almost like a mournful song. It was a haunting and sad melody that seemed to come from the depths of the lagoon. The feeling of being drawn to the water became almost irresistible. Julia fought the urge to come closer, knowing that the Maid de Agua was known for seducing those who dared to approach too closely. She found an old book of legends and myths in an antique store, filled with stories about the Maid de Agua. The pages detailed ancient rituals and offerings made to appease the entity and avoid her wrath. There were mentions of sacrifices and ceremonies performed by the city's ancient inhabitants, trying to connect with the aquatic forces for protection and guidance. Julia learned that to understand the connection between the whispers of the dead and the Maid d'Agua, she needed to perform a specific ritual on the shores of the lagoon, involving symbolic offerings and a plea for peace. The book described a rite that promised to reveal hidden secrets and establish direct communication with the entity. Armed with the necessary items for the ritual, Julia returned to the lagoon on a new moon night, when the darkness enveloped the environment and the sense of mystery was most intense. As she performed the ritual, the atmosphere around her seemed to transform. The water of the lagoon began to stir, and the haunting melody grew louder and more intense. Julia felt a heavy presence around her, as if the Maid d'Agua herself were watching every move she made. The whispers of the dead became clearer as Julia continued the ritual. The words of the whispers began to intertwine with the lagoon's melody, creating a deep sense of connection between what was happening and the legend of the Maid d'Agua. Julia knew she was on the verge of discovering something crucial, a truth hidden in the depths of the city and in the very essence of the legend that had always been just a story. The ritual by the lagoon seemed to have given Julia a clearer understanding of the connection between the whispers of the dead and the Maid d'Agua. However, the sense of urgency and dread was growing. Julia knew that to appease the spirits and find a solution, she would need to resort to deeper and older methods. The next step would involve an even more complex ritual, promising to confront directly the force that had been terrorizing her life. Julia made her way to an old house in the Santa Teresa neighborhood, a place abandoned long ago but still shrouded in mystery. It was known among locals as a site of dark legends and ancient practices. The house, with its peeling walls and broken windows, seemed like the perfect setting for the ritual Julia needed to perform. With the ancient book in hand, Julia began to prepare the space. She lit black candles and arranged esoteric symbols around the room. The atmosphere was thick with tense and unsettling energy. Every step she took seemed to echo through the deserted house, and the absolute silence was broken only by the crackling of the candles and the wind passing through the broken windows. The ritual required a series of meticulous steps, including the invocation of spiritual entities and the offering of symbolic items. Julia recited the ancient words with a trembling yet determined voice, drawing symbols on the floor with salt and ashes. The air was charged with a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the very environment was waiting for the arrival of the spirits. As the ritual progressed, the sense of dread intensified. Julia felt an increasing presence, as if something were materializing from the shadows of the house. The whispers of the dead, which had been mere distant murmurs, grew stronger and clearer. The voices echoed around her, mingling with the sound of the flickering candles. "Don't give up, we're close, the end is near." Julia was completely immersed in the ritual, and the house seemed to come alive with the presence of the spirits. The floor trembled slightly, and an extreme chill filled the space. With each passing moment, Julia felt more connected to the supernatural forces, confronting her deepest fears. As the ritual reached its climax, the candles suddenly went out, plunging the house into total darkness. Julia felt an overwhelming pressure around her, as if an invisible force was trying to overpower her. The fear was almost unbearable, and Julia struggled to maintain her focus, continuing to recite the ritual's words with fervor. Suddenly, the house fell into absolute silence. The voices of the dead ceased abruptly, and the sense of dread seemed to vanish. Julia was exhausted, and the environment around her appeared to have returned to calm. But the feeling that something fundamental had changed was undeniable. The connection with the spiritual world seemed to have been established, and Julia felt she was on the brink of discovering a crucial truth. As the night wore on and the morning light began to seep into the house, Julia knew that the ritual had brought something very deep and disturbing to the surface. What she had awakened was something she did not yet fully understand, but she was certain she was about to uncover the truth behind the terrifying pursuit of the spirits and the legend of the Maid d'Agua. After the ritual, Julia felt she had reached a crucial point in her search, but there was still a lingering sense of incompleteness. The voices of the dead had ceased, but a persistent feeling that the final truth was just out of reach kept her uneasy. Then she remembered an old house in the waterfront area, known locally as the Casa de Pedra. The house was shrouded in mystery and rumors of supernatural events, and Julia felt it might hold the key to solving the enigma. The Casa de Pedra was an imposing, solemn structure perched on a hill overlooking the port. Its stone walls were covered in moss and graffiti, and its long broken windows gave a disturbing view of the darkness inside. The house had been abandoned for decades, and the neighborhood seemed to have forgotten its existence, as if the house were being absorbed by the city. As Julia arrived, twilight was setting in, and the atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding. The sound of waves crashing against the pier and the distant cry of seagulls provided a sinister backdrop for her mission. Julia felt a mix of anxiety and determination as she approached the house's entrance. With a flashlight and an old key she had found in the Book of Legends, Julia pried open the rusted door with a creaking groan. The inside of the house was a cavern of shadows and dust, with decaying furniture and spider-covered ceilings. As Julia moved through the dark corridors, the whispers of the dead began to return, but this time, they were clearer and more directed. "Find the truth, the secret is here." She followed the whispers to a spiral staircase leading down to an underground basement. The basement walls were covered in ancient symbols and inscriptions, similar to those she had seen in the book. The chill and desolation increased as she descended the steps, and the sound of the murmurs seemed to grow louder. In the center of the basement, Julia found an ancient altar, covered with melted candles and remnants of offerings. The altar seemed to have been used recently, and the atmosphere was filled with unsettling energy. She noticed a series of stone boxes stacked next to the altar, adorned with enigmatic inscriptions and arcane symbols. With a mix of trepidation and hope, Julia opened one of the boxes. Inside, she found old documents and artifacts that seemed to tell the story of the house and its former occupants. The documents were records of occult practices and rituals connected to the legend of the May de Agua. The notes detailed agreements and pacts made with spiritual entities to protect the city from a greater evil, an evil that now seemed to be manifesting through the whispers. The most disturbing revelation was an old letter written by one of the house's former owners. The letter described a dark pact made to gain power and protection, but which had inadvertently unleashed a malevolent force now seeking revenge. The pact, made with the May de Agua, had been broken, and the spirits of the dead were seeking justice through torment and pursuit. As Julia absorbed these revelations, the environment around her seemed to transform into a whirlwind of emotions and spiritual energy. The air was thick with a sense of imminent confrontation, and Julia knew she was close to understanding the true extent of the threat she faced. The Casa de Pedra had revealed the connection between the ancient pact and the current events, and now Julia was about to confront the final truth about the spirits, the May de Agua, and the fate of her own life. As Julia uncovered the hidden truths in the Casa de Pedra, the tension and fear reached their peak. The revelations about the dark pact and the malevolent force it had unleashed heightened the sense of urgency. The feeling that the final confrontation was imminent was palpable, and Julia knew she needed to face the source of all the terror that had plagued her life. The basement was now shrouded in dense darkness, with shadows dancing on the walls and a chilling cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. Julia prepared for what was to come, arranging the ritual items and ancient artifacts around the altar. What she had learned about the pact indicated that to restore order, she needed to confront the entity that had been awakened directly. The sound of the whispers grew louder as Julia completed the final preparations. The candles she had lit on the altar began to flicker, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was thick with a heavy, oppressive energy, as if the very space was bracing itself for the confrontation. With a deafening roar, a supernatural force began to manifest in the basement. Julia saw a spectral figure materialize at the center of the altar, a dark, imposing entity with eyes glowing with a sinister red light. It was the manifestation of the evil conjured by the ancient pact, a force now seeking revenge and chaos. Julia faced the entity with determination. Following the instructions from the book and the notes she had found, she began to recite the words of the exorcism ritual, her voice trembling but resolute. The air was saturated with turbulent energy, and the entity reacted with fury, unleashing waves of dark energy that made the space tremble. The spectral form advanced towards Julia with an intensity that nearly made her retreat. The presence was overwhelming, and the sense of terror almost paralyzed her. But Julia, fueled by her determination and the desire to end the torment she had endured, continued the ritual. Each word she uttered seemed to provoke a reaction in the entity, which writhed and responded with agonizing screams and groans. As the confrontation unfolded, Julia felt a growing strength, as if the ancient pact itself was being undone. The entity seemed to weaken with each word Julia spoke, and the environment around her began to calm, with the negative energy gradually dissipating. The battle between Julia and the entity continued until, finally, with a final scream of agony, the spectral form began to disintegrate, dissolving into a cloud of dark smoke. The candles around the altar extinguished, and the basement was left in a profound and absolute silence. Julia fell to her knees, exhausted but relieved. The sense of having finally confronted and defeated the malevolent force was indescribable. The environment around her seemed to have returned to calm, and the disturbing presence that had tormented her life had finally disappeared. The Casa de Pedra, now silent, appeared to have regained its peace, as if the weight of the ancient pact had finally been lifted. The battle was won, but Julia knew that the scars from this experience would remain with her forever. What had begun as a terrifying nightmare had turned into a journey of discovery and courage, and now, as she faced the dawn, Julia felt that, despite the suffering, she had achieved a personal and supernatural victory. With the defeat of the dark entity, Julia felt a brief relief, believing that the nightmare had come to an end. The Casa de Pedra now seemed calm, as if the struggle that had taken place there had restored a certain order to the environment. She allowed herself a moment to rest, trying to process everything she had experienced. But that relief was short-lived. A week later, Julia began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in her daily life. The streets of Rio de Janeiro, which once seemed familiar and safe, started to feel strange and threatening again. Fear returned, not as a specific sensation but as a constant presence, a reminder that something was still wrong. One night, while Julia was sleeping, she was awakened by a strange sound coming from her apartment. The familiar whisper was back, but now it was more intense and disturbing. The voices of the dead had returned with a new urgency and a sense of anger. The words she had learned to fear became more frequent and more insistent. The pact was not broken. Evil is rising. There is a price to pay. Julia tried to ignore the whispers, but the feeling of being watched and pursued was present again. The shadows in her apartment seemed to move, and the cold that had disappeared returned with intensity. It was as if the battle she had won at the Casa de Pedra hadn't been the conclusion she had hoped for. Determined to find out what was happening, Julia revisited the old book and notes she had found. Reading the pages again, she noticed something she had missed before. The pact had not been completely undone. There was a clause indicating that the pact could return if the ritual was not performed correctly or if certain conditions were not met. Horrified, Julia realized that she had inadvertently left a loophole for the entity to return. The ancient pact still had traces of influence, and the whispers tormenting her were a sign that evil was rising again, stronger and more relentless than before. The Casa de Pedra had been only a stage in the battle, not the conclusion. Desperate, Julia sought out experts in occultism and ancient rituals. She found an old practitioner of magic, someone with deep knowledge of ancestral rituals and ancient pacts. The man explained that once a pact was made, it had the power to return if it was not completely undone, and that the entity Julia had faced had only retreated temporarily. Together, Julia and the practitioner worked to reverse the pact definitively. This involved a new, more complex and demanding ritual than the previous one. They needed to recreate the old steps with meticulous precision, adding new elements to ensure that the pact was truly undone and that the entity could not return. The work was exhausting and required intense concentration. As Julia and the practitioner performed the ritual in a sacred space, the weight of fear and responsibility was more present than ever. Every movement and every word were crucial to ensure that the evil was finally eradicated. The pressure was immense, and the environment seemed filled with disturbing energy that tested Julia's resolve. The ritual unfolded under nearly unbearable tension. Shadows and whispers were present, trying to interfere and sabotage the process. But Julia, now with renewed understanding and determination, continued with courage. The fate of the city, and possibly her own, depended on the success of this final ritual. The final ritual was reaching its climax, and the tension was palpable. Julia and the magician were deep in frantic work, their actions driven by the urgent need to undo the ancient pact and eliminate the dark entity once and for all. The darkness around them seemed to intensify, as if the city itself was anxiously holding its breath, waiting for the ritual's conclusion. As Julia and the magician worked, something began to happen. The candles around the altar flickered and went out one by one, and a cold, cutting wind swept through, enveloping the space in an aura of despair. The whispers of the dead grew louder, and Julia felt a paralyzing fear as she realized that the entity was manifesting more strongly than before. At the peak of the ritual, an invisible force began to stir, and the dark entity, now more powerful and enraged, made its presence fully known. Julia saw the spectral figure materialize in the center of the space, its eyes glowing with an intense red light and its form writhing in a whirlwind of shadows and fury. As the entity advanced, it seemed like the ritual was on the brink of failure. The magician struggled to maintain focus, his words blending with the entity's desperate screams. Feeling the pressure and weight of the moment, Julia decided she needed to do more than just follow the ritual's instructions. Summoning a burst of courage, Julia faced the entity directly with determination. She began to recite an ancient invocation she had found in the book's notes, a powerful phrase that promised to dismantle the pact and banish the entity once and for all. Her words were charged with intense energy, and she felt she was touching the essence of the evil that had tormented her life. The entity reacted violently, its form distorting and its screams becoming a deafening cacophony. The environment was in complete chaos, and the sense that everything was about to collapse was overwhelming. But Julia continued, her voice steady and clear, as the magician kept the ritual going with near superhuman effort. Finally, with a final scream of agony, the entity began to disintegrate, its form dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that slowly dissipated. The shadows around them began to vanish, and the environment, once filled with terror, began to calm down. Julia and the magician were exhausted, but the weight of the malignant presence had finally disappeared. As silence settled and the darkness began to lift, Julia felt a sense of relief and closure. The ancient pact was finally undone, and the entity that had caused so much suffering had been banished for good. The city, once a scene of terror and despair, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if a heavy shadow had been lifted. Julia knew that the experience had changed her forever. What began as a terrifying nightmare had transformed into a journey of courage and discovery. With the dawn beginning to light up the sky, Julia felt as though she had finally found peace. The scars from the experience would remain, but the truth and victory had brought new hope for the future. As she looked out at the horizon, Julia knew that despite the horrors she had faced, she had found the strength and courage to confront and overcome the evil. The city of Rio de Janeiro, now free from the supernatural threat, could finally return to peace, and Julia could begin to rebuild her life, knowing that she had faced the terror and emerged victorious.